I never imagined that owning a commercial-grade snowblower would lead to a full-blown war with the president of my homeowners association, but life has a funny way of throwing absurd curveballs when you least expect them. For 10 years, I had lived in Maple Creek Estates, a quiet subdivision that prided itself on being unremarkable. My life was as orderly as the lawns I manicured. I owned a small but successful landscaping and snow removal business, a job that kept me outdoors and allowed me to be my own boss. I liked simple things: the smell of fresh-cut grass, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly plowed driveway, and, most of all, being left alone. The neighborhood had always been a peaceful place, governed by an HOA that was, for the most part, dormant. We paid our dues, they cut the grass in the little common area by the entrance, and that was the extent of our relationship. It was a live-and-let-live community, the kind where people borrowed sugar, watched each other's houses during vacations, and minded their own business. The HOA board was a rotating cast of older residents who mostly just wanted to make sure the holiday decorations went up on time. It was benign, functional, and blessedly invisible. That all changed the year Brenda Metcalf moved in. She arrived from some big city, bringing with her a palpable sense of dissatisfaction with our rustic tranquility. Brenda was a woman who seemed to be perpetually wound tight, with a sharp gaze that missed nothing and a voice that could cut glass. She saw not a peaceful community, but a hotbed of unexploited regulatory potential. Within 6 months, she had attended every meeting, volunteered for every committee, and used a combination of relentless enthusiasm and procedural jargon to get herself elected to the board. 3 months after that, the existing president, a gentle retiree named Mr. Henderson, abruptly resigned due to personal reasons, and Brenda ascended to the throne. The changes started small, almost imperceptibly. First came the newsletter, a glossy, professionally printed affair that replaced the old mimeographed sheet. It was filled with friendly reminders that felt anything but friendly. A new rule about trash receptacles appeared: they had to be retrieved from the curb and fully concealed from street view no later than 9 a.m. on collection day. Then came the regulations on lawn ornaments. Gnomes were permissible, but only if they were under 12 inches tall, and tastefully weathered plastic flamingos were, of course, strictly forbidden. An architectural review committee, with Brenda as its chairperson, was formed to approve paint colors, fence styles, and even the type of mulch one could use in their flower beds. Most people just sighed and complied. It was annoying, sure, but it was easier to move your trash can than to pick a fight. We were a community of conflict-averse people who just wanted to grill burgers in our backyards in peace. We tolerated her reign because, at first, it felt like a minor inconvenience, the cost of keeping the neighborhood looking neat. We didn't yet understand that for Brenda, this wasn't about neatness. It was about control. She was building her little kingdom, one petty regulation at a time, and we were the serfs who were expected to fall in line. I, like my neighbors, grumbled quietly but did nothing, content to focus on my work and my own small corner of the world. I had no idea that a record-breaking blizzard was gathering on the horizon, preparing to dump 2 feet of snow on our quiet lives and set me on a direct collision course with the iron-fisted queen of Maple Creek Estates. The storm arrived on a Tuesday in late January, a furious assault of wind and snow that the weather forecasters had dubbed a snowmageddon. For 36 hours, the world outside my window was a churning vortex of white. When it finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the neighborhood, broken only by the distant whine of a city plow. We were buried. The snow was deep, wet, and heavy, the kind that breaks backs and snaps plastic shovels. For me, however, it was just another day at the office. My business was built for this. I fired up my pride and joy of a massive, bright orange commercial snowblower with a heated seat and a powerful engine that roared to life with a satisfying growl. It made short work of my own long driveway, throwing a beautiful arc of snow 20 feet into the yard. Once I was done, I did what I always did in a storm like this. I turned my machine toward the home of my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable. She was in her late 80s, a widow who lived alone and was as sweet as the cookies she sometimes left on my porch. There was no way she could handle this kind of snow. I cleared her driveway and her front walk, making sure to carve out a clear path to her mailbox. I was just finishing up, feeling the simple satisfaction of a job well done and a neighbor helped, when a sharp, insistent voice cut through the morning quiet. "What do you think you're doing?" It was Brenda. She was standing at the end of her own pristine driveway, bundled in a designer parka, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was a mixture of outrage and accusation. I shut off the snowblower's engine, and the sudden silence felt heavy. "Morning, Brenda," I said, trying to keep my tone light. Just digging out Mrs. Gable, I gestured with my mittened hand toward the elderly woman's house, where a light had just flicked on in the kitchen window. "You are operating commercial machinery on residential property," she stated, not asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of any neighborly warmth. "That is a direct violation of Bylaw 17, Section C, regarding commercial activities within the community." I stared at her, genuinely baffled. "Brenda, I'm not running a business. I'm helping a neighbor." "It's what people do. Your business is snow removal, is it not?" she countered, taking a step closer. "And you are using the equipment associated with that business. The engine noise alone is a violation of the nuisance ordinance, especially before 8 a.m. She glanced at a ridiculously expensive-looking watch on her wrist. "It is currently 7:42 a.m. The sheer absurdity of it left me speechless for a moment. We were digging out from a historic blizzard, a state of emergency had been declared, and she was quoting bylaws at me. "Are you serious?" I finally managed to ask. "The entire town is shut down. I'm making sure an elderly woman isn't trapped in her house. The rules do not get suspended for inclement weather," she said, her voice hardening. "If Mrs. Gable requires assistance, she can contact the appropriate services through the management company. Unlicensed, unapproved work creates a liability for the association. You will cease this activity immediately." Before I could even formulate a response, she delivered her final volley. "I am issuing you a formal warning. If you continue, you will be fined. And if you persist, the fines will increase, and we will pursue all available legal remedies. The rules are the rules." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house without another word, leaving me standing in the snow, my ears ringing with the injustice of it all. I looked at my powerful machine, then at Mrs. Gable's safe, cleared driveway, and then at the untouched sidewalks buried under 2 feet of snow. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a declaration of war. And I had a sinking feeling that Brenda Metcalf was an opponent who would never, ever back down. A few days later, the official-looking envelope arrived. It was from the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and the return address included the name of a management company I'd never heard of, Apex Management Services. Inside was a crisply printed letter detailing my transgressions: operation of commercial machinery for non-personal use and a violation of Noise Ordinance 9B. At the bottom was the penalty, a fine of $100. I remember laughing out loud. It was so utterly ridiculous. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. I figured it was just Brenda trying to intimidate me. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was sent via certified mail, which meant I had to sign for it at the post office. The fine was now $200 for failure to cure the initial violation and continued non-compliance. She had apparently seen me use my small, walk-behind snowblower to clear the public sidewalk in front of my house and 3 of my neighbors' properties. The letter included a grainy photograph, clearly taken from her living room window, of me pushing the machine down the pavement. It felt less like a neighborly dispute and more like I was being surveilled by a petty dictator. The anger started to burn a little hotter than the initial amusement. The conflict wasn't just about me anymore, it was beginning to have a tangible, negative impact on the community she claimed to be protecting. The town plows had finally made their way through our streets, but in their wake, they left behind massive, icy berms of snow at the end of every driveway, effectively trapping people in. Mrs. Gable's Meals on Wheels delivery driver couldn't get to her door. Her son, who lived an hour away, called me in a panic. So, I went out with a heavy-duty shovel and my snowblower and cleared the berm for her, and for 2 other elderly couples on the street. It was the right thing to do. The next day, another certified letter. This time, the fine was for $500. The violation was listed as unauthorized alteration of common area properties. Apparently, the snow berms left by the city plows were now considered HOA common property, and I had altered them without submitting a written request to the Architectural Review Committee. This was a level of bureaucratic insanity I couldn't have invented if I'd tried. I started talking to my neighbors. They were all furious, but they were also afraid. "She'll come after me next," one of them, a young father named Tom, told me in a hushed voice over the fence. "I can't afford to fight her. They would thank me quietly for clearing the walks, but no one was willing to stand with me publicly. I was on my own." The final straw came a month after the storm. The fines had now accumulated to over $2,000, a sum I had absolutely no intention of paying. I received a thick packet from the HOA's law firm. It was a formal notice of intent to place a lien on my property for the unpaid fines and associated legal fees. My home. The place I had worked my entire adult life to afford. The idea that this woman could threaten my financial security over an act of neighborly kindness made something inside me snap. The frustration boiled over into cold, hard resolve. This was no longer a spat, it was a fight for my home, and I was done playing defense. I knew I was out of my depth. Brenda had lawyers and bylaws on her side. I had a snowblower and a sense of righteous indignation. It was time to level the playing field. I looked up local attorneys specializing in real estate and HOA law and found a man named Mr. Davies. His office was in a modest building downtown, and he had a reputation for being a no-nonsense, pragmatic lawyer who didn't waste his clients' money. When I sat down with him and laid out the stack of letters and photographs Brenda had sent, he listened patiently, a small, unreadable smile playing on his lips. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair when I had finished my story, "you've certainly run afoul of a particularly aggressive specimen of what we in the business call a petty tyrant. HOA law is notoriously tricky. They have a lot of power, and the covenants you signed when you bought your house are legally binding." My heart sank. "But," he continued, leaning forward, "that power is not absolute. The board's actions must be reasonable, and they must be applied fairly and consistently. Fining you for clearing a path for an elderly neighbor during a state of emergency is, on its face, profoundly unreasonable." He told me that fighting the fines directly in court would be expensive and time-consuming. A judge might side with us, but they could just as easily rule that the letter of the law, however absurd, was on the HOA's side. "Our best strategy," Mr. Davies explained, "is not to fight her on her battlefield. We need to change the battlefield. We need to scrutinize them just as closely as they are scrutinizing you." He advised me to formally request, as is my right as a homeowner, a complete copy of the HOA's financial records, meeting minutes, and current bylaws. "Let's see if Queen Brenda runs her kingdom as perfectly as she expects her subjects to." Armed with a new sense of purpose, I went home and drafted the formal request letter, citing the specific state statutes Mr. Davies had given me. I sent it, again by certified mail, to the HOA's official address. The response was telling. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. Then, I received a letter from Brenda stating that my request was overly broad and would take time to compile. She was stonewalling. Mr. Davies had anticipated this. He sent a much sharper letter on his official letterhead, giving them 10 business days to comply or face legal action to compel them. That seemed to do the trick. A week later, a thick manila envelope landed on my porch. While I waited for the documents, I started talking to Arthur, a retired engineer who lived down the street from me. Arthur had been one of the first people to build a house in Maple Creek Estates 30 years ago. He was quiet, thoughtful, and possessed a razor-sharp memory. He had served on the original HOA board and still had a copy of the original covenants and bylaws, before they had been amended and re-amended into the weaponized manuscript Brenda now wielded. We sat in his study, surrounded by books and schematics, and he confirmed my suspicions. The original intent of the association was just to manage the front entrance and the retention pond, he said, shaking his head. We never envisioned it would be used to police people's garbage cans. The documents Brenda finally sent were a mess. The meeting minutes were vague and uninformative. The bylaws were a labyrinth of confusing addendums. But the financial statements were where I focused my attention. I spread them out on my dining room table and went through them, line by line. Most of it was standard stuff, landscaping for the common areas, insurance, water for the sprinklers at the entrance. But one line item jumped out at me, and it appeared every 3 months with suspicious regularity: quarterly property inspections, Apex Management Services. The fee was significant, $1,500 per quarter. $6,000 a year. I had a pretty good idea of what was happening in my neighborhood. I was outside working nearly every day, in every season. I knew the mailman's name, the UPS driver's route, and which neighbors walked their dogs at what time. In all my years living here, I had never once seen a person who looked like an inspector walking the streets, clipboard in hand, checking for violations. Apex Management Services. That was the name on the first letter I had received. They were the ones supposedly managing the HOA. But who were they? A quick search online for the company yielded almost nothing. There was no professional website, no list of services, just a bare-bones business registration with a post office box in a town 50 miles away. This felt wrong. My mind started racing. How could you prove someone wasn't there? How could you document a non-event? And then, an idea sparked, born from 1,000 true crime documentaries and late-night internet rabbit holes. I pulled up Google Maps on my computer and typed in my address. I clicked on the Street View image. There was my house, my truck in the driveway. The image was dated from the previous summer. I knew this because my prize-winning rose bushes were in full bloom. I used the feature to drive down my street, looking at the familiar houses. Then I found the little clock icon in the corner of the screen. See more dates. I clicked it. A timeline of images appeared, stretching back over the last decade. Google's cars had driven through our neighborhood multiple times, capturing snapshots in time, year after year. My heart started to beat faster. I pulled out the HOA's financial statements again and looked at the invoices from Apex Management Services. The first invoice was dated April 5th, 2 years ago. For the first quarter inspection, I looked at the Street View history. There was an image capture from April 12th of that year. I zoomed in. The lawns were just starting to green up. Then I looked at the next invoice, July 8th. I found a Street View capture from July 20th. The trees were full and leafy. I did this for every single invoice from Apex. For 8 consecutive quarters, I found a corresponding Street View image taken within days or weeks of the invoice date. And in not a single one of those images, spanning 2 years of seasonal changes, different times of day, different days of the week, was there any sign of an inspector. No strange car parked on the side of the road. No person with a clipboard walking the sidewalks. Nothing. Of course, this wasn't absolute proof. An inspector could have come on a day the Google car wasn't there. But it was a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence. It was a pattern. $6,000 a year being paid to a ghost company for a service that, as far as I could tell, was never, ever performed. I wasn't just fighting a fine anymore. This was bigger. This was about fraud. I now had the leverage Mr. Davies had talked about. The power dynamic in my war with Brenda Metcalf had just fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the defendant, I was the prosecutor. And I had just found my star witness, a fleet of silent, unmanned camera cars that had been documenting the truth all along. Armed with this revelation, my entire approach changed. The fear and frustration that had been my constant companions were replaced by a cold, calculated sense of purpose. I was no longer just defending myself, I was on the offensive, building a case against the very person who had made my life a living hell for the past several months. I called Mr. Davies immediately and laid out what I had found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jack," he finally said, his voice a mixture of surprise and admiration, "that is brilliant. It's not a smoking gun, but it's the next best thing. It establishes a pattern of behavior that any reasonable person would find deeply suspicious." He advised me on the next steps. We couldn't just accuse her, we had to present the evidence in a way that was undeniable and public. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. "That's our venue," he said. "It's the one place where she can't control the narrative. The homeowners are the jury. The next phase of my investigation was to dig deeper into Apex Management Services. The post office box was a dead end, but Mr. Davies's paralegal found something I had missed. The company was registered as a limited liability company with the state, and the state's corporate commission website listed the name of the registered agent. When the paralegal read the name to me over the phone, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening thud. The registered agent was a woman named Brenda Paskett. It took me a minute to place the name, but then I remembered a conversation with Arthur. He had mentioned that Brenda Metcalf's maiden name was Paskett. The address listed for this registered agent was in a different state, at her sister's house. The money wasn't just going to a ghost company. It was going to her. She had created a shell corporation, likely using her maiden name to avoid immediate detection, and was using it to funnel $6,000 a year directly from the HOA's coffers into her own pocket. She wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a common thief. The fines, the harassment, the obsessive rule enforcement, it was all a smokescreen. It was a way to assert her authority and intimidate anyone who might get curious enough to look at the books. She was counting on the fact that we were all too busy, too tired, or too scared to ever question her. She had severely underestimated me. My strategy was now set. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the meeting as if it were a courtroom trial. I printed large, high-quality copies of the financial statements, with the payments to Apex Management Services highlighted in yellow. I made poster-sized printouts of the Google Street View images corresponding to each invoice date. I created a simple timeline showing the payments, the dates, and the photographic evidence of non-activity. I also drafted a sworn affidavit, a legal statement, detailing my observations, or lack thereof, of any inspection activity over the past 2 years. I took it to Arthur, who read it carefully and signed one of his own without hesitation. I then cautiously approached Tom, the young father who had been afraid to speak up. I showed him my evidence. His fear was replaced by a look of grim determination. He signed one, too. The night of the annual meeting arrived. The meetings were usually held in the small, sterile community room of the local library. In previous years, attendance was pitiful. Maybe 5 or 6 residents would show up, listen to Brenda drone on about mulch violations, and then leave. But tonight was different. Arthur, Tom, and I had quietly spread the word. We didn't share all the details, but we let it be known that important financial matters were going to be discussed and that the ongoing issue of the excessive fines would be addressed. The room was packed. Nearly every household was represented. There weren't enough chairs. People were standing along the back wall. The air was thick with tension and resentment. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, a mousy woman named Carol and a grumpy man named Stan. She looked out at the unexpectedly large crowd with an expression of annoyance, as if our presence was an inconvenience. She ran the first part of the meeting with her usual iron fist, reading reports in a monotone and shutting down any questions with curt, dismissive answers. She seemed to be trying to rush through the agenda, to get to the end before any real discussion could break out. But the agenda had one final item, New Business and Homeowner Forum. This was my moment. The chair recognizes the floor for any new business, Brenda said, her voice tight. I stood up. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on me. My name is Jack Riley, I live at 12, Maple Lane, I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I have some questions regarding the association's financial expenditures. Brenda's eyes narrowed. Financial questions should be submitted in writing to the board, she snapped. This is not the proper forum actually, according to our bylaws, I said, holding up the thick document. The annual meeting is precisely the forum for homeowners to review and discuss the financial health and management of the association. I'd like to discuss the payments made to a company called Apex Management Services. I walked to the front of the room and set up a small projector I had brought. I placed the first financial statement on the projector, and the highlighted line item appeared on the screen behind Brenda. For the past 2 years, the HOA has paid this company $1,500 every quarter for quarterly property inspections. That's a total of $12,000. I'd like to ask the board what these inspections entailed. Brenda was momentarily flustered. They are standard inspections, she stammered. To ensure compliance with community standards. It's a routine management service, I see, I said calmly. Then perhaps you can explain this. I replaced the financial statement with the first of my poster-sized Google Street View images. It showed our street, bathed in summer sunlight. This image was taken by a Google Street Mapping vehicle on July 20th, 12 days after the HOA paid Apex for a second quarter inspection. I've lived here for 10 years, and I'm outside a lot. I've never seen an inspector from this company. I'm curious if anyone else here has. I paused and looked out at the crowd. Has anyone here, at any time in the past 2 years, seen a representative from Apex Management Services conducting an inspection of our neighborhood? A wave of murmurs swept through the room, followed by a chorus of no. Not a single person raised their hand. I continued, methodically. I put up the next invoice, followed by the next corresponding Street View image. Spring, fall, winter. Invoice, photo. Invoice, photo. The pattern was damning. The room grew quieter, the residents leaning forward in their seats, their expression shifting from curiosity to suspicion, and then to outright anger. Brenda's face had gone from red to a pale, waxy white. Her 2 board members were looking at her with growing panic. It's possible we just missed them, Brenda said, her voice strained. They do drive-by inspections. They are very discreet. $12,000 seems like a lot for a discreet drive-by, I countered. But the real issue is this. I projected my final piece of evidence onto the screen. It was the corporate filing from the state website. The camera zoomed in on the name of the registered agent, Brenda Paskett. Brenda, I said, turning to face her directly, my voice ringing with clarity in the silent room. Isn't your maiden name Paskett? The gasp that swept through the room was audible. It was a collective intake of breath as the full scope of the deception became clear to everyone at once. Brenda stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. Her carefully constructed world of rules and regulations was shattering around her. The authority she had wielded with such arrogance had evaporated in an instant. This is a misunderstanding, she finally managed to choke out. It's a conflict of interest, perhaps, but not. Her voice trailed off as she saw the looks on the faces of her neighbors. There was no sympathy there. Only cold, hard fury. Stan, the board member to her left, pushed his chair back. Brenda, did you tell us about this? Did you disclose that this was your company? He demanded, his voice trembling with rage. She just shook her head, unable to speak. In the back of the room, a man I didn't know stood up. He was tall, with a calm, authoritative demeanor. My name is Frank Gable, he said, and I realized it was Mrs. Gable's son, the retired police detective. What you have just witnessed is not a conflict of interest. It is felony theft by deception, and it is wire fraud. I am placing a call to the district attorney's office right now. He held up his phone. The meeting descended into complete and utter chaos. Brenda, in a blind panic, tried to gather her papers and flee, but she was surrounded by a wall of her angry neighbors, all demanding answers, all shouting at once. Her reign was over. It had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a camera on a Google car and the righteous anger of a community that had finally had enough. The immediate aftermath of the meeting was a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Frank Gable contacted the authorities, and the district attorney's office launched a formal investigation. It didn't take them long. With the evidence I had compiled and the testimony of nearly every resident in Maple Creek, the case against Brenda was overwhelming. She was arrested a week later, a spectacle that played out in front of her perfectly manicured lawn for the entire neighborhood to see. The sight of her being led away in handcuffs was a surreal, almost cinematic, end to her tyrannical rule. She didn't fight or protest, she just looked small, defeated, and utterly pathetic. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, Brenda's lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony embezzlement. The judge was not lenient. He spoke at length about the abuse of trust and the predatory nature of her crimes against her own neighbors. She was sentenced to 18 months in a low-security state prison, 5 years of probation upon her release, and, most importantly, was ordered to pay full restitution of the $12,000 she had stolen, plus all associated legal fees incurred by the HOA. Her house went up for sale a month later, sold to a young family who had no idea of the drama that had recently unfolded there. For me, vindication was swift and complete. One of the first acts of the new interim board, headed by a reluctant but highly competent Arthur, was to hold an emergency session. They voted unanimously to void every single fine Brenda had issued over the past year. The $2,000 penalty hanging over my head, along with the threat of a lien on my home, vanished as if it had never existed. I received a formal letter of apology from the new board, thanking me for my diligence and courage in uncovering the malfeasance. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. It felt like a heavy, oppressive cloud had lifted. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been afraid to make eye contact were now stopping to chat on the sidewalk. The ridiculous rules about trash cans and lawn gnomes were unceremoniously struck from the bylaws at the next meeting. The atmosphere of suspicion was replaced by a renewed sense of community, forged in the fire of our shared experience. I became something of a local hero, which was a role I was deeply uncomfortable with. People would wave as I drove my truck down the street. Mrs. Gable baked me a steady supply of apple pies. Tom insisted on buying me a case of my favorite beer. It was humbling and a bit overwhelming. I hadn't set out to be a champion, I just wanted to be left alone to help my neighbors. But in the end, it turned out that fighting for that simple right was the most neighborly thing I could have done. The HOA itself was completely reformed. Under Arthur's quiet leadership, a new, much simpler set of covenants was drafted and approved. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community enhancement. The HOA dues were actually lowered, since we were no longer paying a fraudulent $6,000 management fee. The new board was transparent, publishing detailed financial reports every quarter and holding open, friendly meetings where people's concerns were actually heard. Maple Creek Estates went back to being the quiet, unremarkable, and peaceful place it had always been meant to be. It was better, actually, because now we all knew each other a little more, and we knew that if we stood together, there was no petty tyrant we couldn't overcome. We had taken back our community. A couple of years passed. Life in Maple Creek Estate settled into a comfortable, peaceful rhythm. The story of Brenda and the fraudulent inspections became a piece of neighborhood law, a cautionary tale told to new residents about the dangers of unchecked power. Property values, which had stagnated under her oppressive regime, began to climb again. The neighborhood was thriving, filled with the sounds of kids playing and neighbors chatting over fences. It was everything a community should be. One Saturday afternoon, I was in a grocery store in the next town over, picking up supplies for a weekend barbecue. As I rounded the end of an aisle, I saw her. It was Brenda. She looked older than I remembered, and the sharp, imperious energy that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a weary, beaten-down emptiness. Her hair was a mousy brown, no longer the severe, perfectly coiffed helmet she used to wear. She was pushing a cart with a few generic brand items in it, her eyes fixed on the floor. Our eyes met for a brief, awkward moment. A flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of what looked like shame, passed over her face. She quickly looked away, turning her cart and heading down a different aisle. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I felt no anger, no desire for revenge, not even a sense of satisfaction. Seeing her like that, a diminished, anonymous figure in a discount grocery store, just made me feel a quiet sense of pity. Her kingdom was gone, her power was a memory, and all she had left was the quiet disgrace of her actions. It was a sad, pathetic end, and it provided a finality that was more profound than any prison sentence. In the end, the whole ordeal taught me a few things. It taught me that bullies, no matter how much power they seem to have, are often propped up by the silence of those they intimidate. They rely on the assumption that good people will be too afraid or too apathetic to stand up and say, "This is not right." It also showed me the corrosive nature of even the smallest amount of power. Brenda wasn't some criminal mastermind, she was just an insecure person who got a taste of authority and let it consume her, convincing herself that her petty theft was justified because she was the one bringing order to the community. She believed her own hype, and that was her ultimate downfall. But the most important lesson was about the strength of a community when it finally decides to act like one. For a long time, we were just a collection of houses, a group of individuals living side by side. But when we were pushed, when one of our own was threatened for a simple act of kindness, we found a common voice. We remembered that the lines on a property map don't matter as much as the people living on either side of them. The bylaws and regulations are just paper. The real foundation of a neighborhood is decency, respect, and a willingness to look out for one another. Today, as I drive my plow truck through the streets of Maple Creek on a cold winter morning, the feeling is different. Another storm is coming, and I know that when it hits, I'll fire up my big orange machine and clear the way for Mrs. Gable, and for anyone else who needs it. I'll do it without a second thought, without looking over my shoulder. Because I know now that I'm not just clearing snow. I'm taking care of my neighbors. I'm doing my part in a community that I helped save. I'm just a guy with a landscaping business, a man who prefers the company of engines to people. But for a short, strange time, I was forced to be a leader, an investigator, and a reluctant hero. Now, I can go back to just being Jack, and our neighborhood, quiet and unremarkable once more, is all the stronger for it.